Imagine living in a small windowless room with no furniture. The lights are on 24/7. You have no human contact. You have no phone, no television, no internet. No one comes to visit, and you're not allowed to leave it. Now imagine doing that for 13,140 days. That's the story of terrible Tommy Silverstein.
You just can't do that to people year after year after year, day after day after day, and have one of that kind of pressure and not expect something to explode.
Well, we always have an odd one in the crowd, so it's kind of odd.
Decidedly odd.
Doesn't that strike you as a little bit odd?
No, that doesn't strike me as a little bit odd.
It's the Bob and Sheri Oddcast, with stuff we wouldn't, couldn't, or shouldn't do on the regular show. Now, here's the Oddcast.
We are big true crime fans, Max and I, and every once in a while you stumble across a story that you kind of knew a little bit about, but then you do some digging and it just takes your breath away. And this is the story of Thomas Silverstein. He's a brutal, remorseless, violent killer. He was the most isolated prisoner in the U.S. correction system in the history of our country. He spent 36 years in solitary confinement. That's 13,140 days. 36 years. The cell was soundproof. They left the lights on 24 hours a day, and they left him locked up. And he lived in that solitary confinement for those 36 years, more than 3 decades, no contact with other human beings. According to Tommy Silverstein, it was worse than torture. He said it would have been more humane to kill me immediately than to bury a man alive. So let's take a look at Tommy Silverstein's story. And in no way are you going to leave this episode thinking, well, he didn't deserve punishment. Because the truth of it is, when you hear his crimes and you hear from one of the corrections officers that was present, and we have that for you too, you'll agree that some kind of justice needed to be administered. But 36 years in solitary confinement. So Tommy Silverstein was born in 1952 in Long Beach, California. His mom and dad had already divorced. And she remarried a man named Sid Silverstein, and Thomas took Silverstein's name. As a kid, he was bullied. They lived in a working class neighborhood in Long Beach, and he was bullied, and he suffered a tremendous amount of anti-Semitic slurs because of his last name. People assumed he was Jewish and would just absolutely torment him, name calling, threats of violence, rock throwing. Well, one day, Tommy's mother, Virginia, saw Tommy being bullied by another kid when Tommy was walking home from school. So his mother grabbed this kid, dragged him into the Silverstein's backyard, and forced her son Tommy to beat him up. Tommy said, I took one look at my mom and I took one look at Gary, and I knew there wasn't any choice at all. I smacked him as hard as I could. And this began the cycle of violence that followed Tommy Silverstein all the way to the end of his days. In fact, the next day, after Tommy's mom made him beat up Gary in the backyard, Gary's dad saw Tommy and dragged him over to his house for Gary to respond in kind. And at that point, Tommy's mom drove over to Gary's house and started throwing bricks through the windows. So we'll pause here and say, Tommy did not have the most optimal parenting. Can we all agree with that, right? It was almost like his mom taught him early on that violence and more violence was how you solved a problem. And it wasn't but a few years later, when Tommy Silverstein turned 14, he stole a car and he assaulted a cop. For that, he was sentenced to a reform school in California. And he said, the only thing I learned there was more violence. And when he was released from reform school, he began using heroin and became addicted. And so to finance his habit, he was committing armed robberies. And he was arrested alongside his own cousin in 1971 and sent to San Quentin prison. Then he was paroled from San Quentin, And he committed more armed robberies on parole and was arrested again. And at that, the judge had enough. Banged the gavel and sentenced Tommy Silverstein to 15 years at the U.S. Penitentiary in Leavenworth, which was a hardcore prison back in the day. Leavenworth was no place for anyone, much less a 19-year-old kid. But what he did at Leavenworth led to the creation and the widespread sort of, kind of proliferation, I guess, of supermax prisons and the practice of putting extremely violent offenders in solitary confinement. So it was at Leavenworth that Tommy Silverstein joined the Aryan Brotherhood. And the Aryan Brotherhood, of course, you'll know, is it's a really violent, organized crime gang inside U.S. prison systems. It's not tremendously huge. I did, before we did this episode, I did some reading and research on the Aryan Brotherhood because I think most people have heard of it. Wouldn't you agree, Max?
Oh, I'm sure, yeah.
Most people have heard of it, and you just sort of have this idea that it's so much more vast than it is. It's a neo-Nazi prison gang. And what it lacks in size, it's only got about 15 to 20,000 members inside and outside the correction system. What it lacks in size, it makes up for in violence and racism, drug trafficking, extortion, murder for hire. The membership is whites only because it is super racist. It varies from prison to prison, but it's very organized, not unlike the mafia. And the Aryan Brotherhood, they use all kinds of different symbols, including swastikas, which you might expect, but also shamrocks and some other strange things. And when you join the Aryan Brotherhood, you have to swear a blood oath. And part of that is your willingness to kill another inmate if asked. So it was at Leavenworth, Kansas, that Tommy Silverstein joined the Aryan Brotherhood. And that's when things really started going sideways. So he did the bidding of the Brotherhood. And we're going to talk a little bit about that straight ahead. So now Tommy Silverstein is in Leavenworth. He joins the Aryan Brotherhood. He takes the blood oath, and he is soon enough asked to murder another inmate. That inmate was Danny Atwell. The Brotherhood wanted Danny Atwell to basically be a drug mule and bring drugs inside Leavenworth, like hardcore drugs, heroin, like bad hardcore stuff. And so Silverstein was told by the Brotherhood, you got to kill him. So he did. And for that, Silverstein was sentenced to life, and he was transferred to another penitentiary, this one in Marion, Illinois. So that conviction, by the way, for killing Danny Atwell was overturned in the mid-1980s because some of the witnesses for the prosecution had committed perjury. But it really didn't matter for Tommy at that point, because by the time his conviction for murdering Danny Atwell was overturned, he and another inmate had already murdered a guy named Robert Chappell, who was in a different prison gang, the DC Blacks. And that gang leader was transferred to Marion during the trial. So that gang leader planned to kill Silverstein to avenge Chappell's death. But Silverstein and the other inmate, whose name was Clayton Fountain, they acted first. They stabbed him 67 times, killing him. And now Silverstein had a second life sentence. So that brings us to October 22nd, 1983. Silverstein made a homemade key and he unlocked his handcuffs. And he stabbed a corrections officer, and that was prison guard Merle Klutz. He stabbed him to death for bullying him and destroying the artwork in his cell. And we have a conversation with another guard who was in the prison, in the penitentiary at Marion, who talks about what that awful day was like.
He just stepped in the boxcar and Golden Nets took the handcuffs off of him, handed him a shank, and then Silverstein come running out with the shank in his hand. And the guard that was standing there with him, he just put his hands up, stepped back out of the way, and said, "Tommy, don't do it." Tommy said, "Hey, I don't want you, I want him." So he run past that guard, and he run down there and started stabbing on Klutz. Well, now after Klutz was killed, the administration would not let the guards go down that range to shake down and get the weapon. They wouldn't let the guards shake down any cell. They said, no, just go ahead and run these guys to showers and rec cage, just like nothing happened. We said, what about Klutz's blood all over the place here? He said, well, you let these new guards walk through that man's blood. That way they'll remember how goddamn dangerous their job is.
It really gives you, just listening to that corrections officer talking, it really gives you an idea of the incredible stress that must come from working in that sort of prison environment. You know, you're afraid for your life all the time, and there's a bounty on your head. And at the time that Silverstein murdered the guard, Merle Klutz, there was no federal death penalty in place for killing a guard. So instead, he was placed in solitary confinement, and they wired the light in the ceiling to be on permanently because they kept him under 24-hour video surveillance. His meals were delivered to him through a slot in the door, and he was only allowed 2 phone calls per month. And that lasted until 2005, when he was transferred to Florence, Colorado, the ADX facility in Florence, Colorado, which was the very highest security prison in the federal system. He was placed in an 80 square foot cell, and he was confined for 23 hours per day. That remaining hour, he was brought to a small cage where he was allowed to exercise. And that's where he lived for 36 years. In that cage in Florence, Colorado, 23 hours per day. And we have a little description, a little bit of sound from the guard describing what the warden's reaction was to Tommy Silverstein and Clayton Fountain. And this gives you an idea of just, again, how brutal the environment was.
3 weeks later, they stabbed a guard, stabbed him 16 times. And as I was coming up to the unit, Officer Pallas came stumbling out the door, and he was all covered in blood, and he fell down to his knees, and says, "Get Hoffman, Hale, get Hoffman." So I turned around and run into the hospital, which is right there next to me. I run in there to get a stretcher. And when I run in there, I saw Ditterline laying there on a bed and had blood squirting out of his left side, by his heart, just, bubbling up. So I grabbed him in a bear hug to help stop the bleeding, and I moved him off that table onto another table because I knew Hoffman was in real bad shape if they was all hollering for Hoffman, Another turnip inmate, spread eagle, buck-ass naked down the corridor, and the assistant warden, Cole Hain, in a 3-piece suit, got his tie, and he's dressed real nice. Runs up between this inmate's legs and grabs him by the nuts. Starts jerking and twisting and laughing and having a good time. And yeah, who's fucking who now, boys? Who's fucking who now?
Later on in life, Tommy Silverstein said that he regretted killing the guard Klutz. And he really was a loud and vocal critic of the prison system's reliance on solitary confinement, which in his case was 36 years worth. He said, quote, "The Board of Prison shrinks chalk it up to me being so isolated that I don't have anyone to fight with, but they're totally oblivious to all the petty bullshit I could go off on if I chose to. I just have more self-control now after 25 years of yoga, meditation, studying Buddhism, and taking some anger management courses. All of that goes unacknowledged." He had 25 years of good behavior, and multiple evaluations by prison psychiatrists demonstrated that he was a low risk for future violence. But no matter how he tried, he was unsuccessful in any challenge he made to his solitary confinement. In 2011, the case went to a federal judge who ruled that the conditions of his solitary confinement were not, quote, atypically extreme. And a couple years later, another court, the 10th Circuit of Appeals, said, 30 years of solitary does not amount to cruel and unusual punishment. But Tommy Silverstein himself said that solitary confinement was, quote, a constant peeling of the skin, the stripping of the flesh, the nerve-wracking sound of water dripping from a leaky faucet in the still of the night while you're trying to sleep. Drip, drip, drip. The minutes, the hours, the days, weeks, months, years, constantly dripping away with no end or relief in sight. Drip, drip, drip. 13,140 days. So whatever happened to terrible Tommy Silverstein? Well, he'd been hospitalized after all of those years with complications following a heart surgery procedure. And on May 11th, 2019, he died at age 67. And a weird thing has happened. And if you search terrible Tommy Silverstein, and you do a deep dive in some of the darker places on the net, he's been embraced as a hero. In part because of his connection to the Aryan Brotherhood. And I don't think it comes as surprising news to anybody listening to this in the year 2022 that we're in a period of history where hate and hate speech is shockingly on the rise in America in ways that I think a lot of people did not anticipate seeing. Like, I never thought I'd see Nazis marching in Florida, for God's sakes, and that happened in January, right, Max?
Yeah, it did.
We had Nazis marching around in January. The people who've embraced like Nazi ideology, I'm like, what the fuck? You don't have the History Channel? Like, okay, maybe you don't like books, but you don't have cable, and yet there's a huge wave of anti-Semitism and hate that has kind of boiled up and over in our country. And so a man like Tommy Silverstein, becomes a heroic figure for certain people. And you certainly could make an argument, and I think it's a fair argument, that no matter his crimes, that perhaps 36 years in a small windowless room with zero human contact is excessive and harsh punishment. What do you think, Max?
One of the things that we talk about in our country is cruel and unusual punishment. And I think that given the situation with him where he was able to show some kind of improvement through the course of time, and he was getting older as well, that he should have been allowed to move beyond that at some point along the line. And I understand the nature of his crime. I understand all that. I mean, he was not a good guy, but certainly you have to have sympathy for the fact that he was a human being. Nobody ceases being human through all of that. And if he had shown improvement and had shown that he was less violent, you'd think that there'd be some mechanism in place that would have allowed him to be able to perhaps move into the general population. Because people act like being in solitary confinement. I'm sure that the family of the guard who was murdered, certainly, or the other men that were murdered, I'm sure that they have certain feelings about him. But, at the same time, when we incarcerate people, we're responsible for them. We're responsible for what happens with them and what's best for their mental health. And I think that there should have been some mechanism in place that would have allowed him to progress in the system to be able to maybe never get out, but at least join the general population.
I think that you make all great points. This happened not in 1919, but in 2019. That's when Silverstein died. I mean, we don't think of ourselves as a nation without mercy. And it is possible to have justice tempered by mercy. Isn't that what we're going for, right? Is justice tempered by mercy. That said, Silverstein's crimes were appalling. He was obsessed with Officer Merle Klutz. Absolutely obsessed. He spent months planning and plotting that murder, making the shank, looking for just exactly the moment. Klutz had been stabbed 40 times. It was a brutal, brutal death. The FBI investigated and cleared Klutz of any wrongdoing. Silverstein had accused him of harassment. But when we look at some of the conditions that Silverstein was kept in, it's really troubling. For example, when they first put him in solitary, he only had his boxer shorts. That's it. And guards were stationed around the clock to watch him under video. That lasted for 6 months. He's in that room in only his boxer shorts. After that 6-month period, he was given some privileges, including drawing materials, and he became an artist, entirely self-taught. The prison system refused to allow him to enter his work into any of the prison-sponsored art shows at Leavenworth because they do this thing where they let prisoners submit their work, and then the public can buy it, and then the prisoners get to keep that money, I guess, in their commissary accounts or whatever. They declined that for Silverstein because they didn't want him to profit off of his notoriety. Silverstein, before he died, said that the only way to understand him was through his art. And it's, I can post a link so that you can look at some of the drawings. He did some self-portraits. He did a lot of sort of editorial cartoons about, prison life. He did some, pretty extraordinary drawings. But none of that changes the fact of his crime, and none of that alters the circumstances of his punishment. The government, in case you're wondering, was there some paperwork lost? The government reviewed his solitary confinement every 6 months, and at no time was it deemed that he could be moved into an environment where he could interact. He was visited with other inmates. He was visited once a month by prison psychologists, and the psychologists determined his mental health and his stability. And I think one of the more extraordinary parts of this story is that he remained sane up until his death in 2019. And I'm not being sympathetic to him. He's about as bad as it gets.
He's a bad guy. But the one thing is, let's not. I guess the feeling that I have is let's not be bad. That kind of bad in response to. There's no way of saying this without somebody saying that I'm being too soft. But the point is, we need to be able to look at cruel and unusual punishment, and I believe, maybe foolishly, in redemption for anyone. I do believe that, unless you're a psychopath or a sociopath, and that's not the case with this guy.
No.
But that's what I believe, because I've seen it happen with people. I've seen them make these remarkable transformations in their lives, from being violent felons to having useful lives, and I've gotten a chance to witness some of it up close. So that's why I feel that way. I'm not doing it from the standpoint of just saying this is my opinion. I've been able to watch it up close. A lot of people don't realize Max does a tremendous amount of community service work in the correction system. And it's not something we ever really talk about because it's really private stuff. These are real people and their real lives, and we don't make light of it. The Bob and Sheri show is not a place for that. And I know that you've seen firsthand, even people who have committed very, very heinous acts. You've seen that transformation. My husband's always telling me, "Woman, you're soft." I mean, I'm an actual social worker. Yeah, but
and so I look at the circumstances of Tommy Silverstein's life, and I'm like, damn, not every kid who comes up in an abusive and bizarre home turns into a killer. I mean, I'm walking proof of that. But it takes some pretty extraordinary lucky breaks to save a kid who comes up in that environment. Does that make sense?
Yes. And like I said, I have seen some things happen that have been so remarkable that you would say, hey, you've just witnessed a miracle. And I don't mean some sort of moment of feeling good or some sort of emotional moment. I mean, I'm talking about people who have transformed their lives, and to be able to see that. So I am of the belief that if you are not a sociopath or a psychopath, that everybody has this innate goodness inside. No matter what happens.
And that said, in no way are you suggesting that, he should have been let out.
No. That's not, that is not at all what I'm saying. No. But you have to take a look and just say, how are you treating somebody? Yeah, I understand what he did, and I understand that they didn't have anything in place for really dealing with him. But at some point along the line, you have to say we have to be moral about how we handle people. It is, as the state or as the federal, it is our responsibility to be able to handle them in a way that is moral.
And so that circles us all the way around to is putting a human being in a windowless room with no contact for 13,140 days. Is that moral? And is that the best practice of justice in this case?
It doesn't look like it.
It doesn't feel like it. And then again, that in no way lets Tommy Silverstein off the hook, or the Aryan Brotherhood or any of it. But what we do on the Oddcast, every episode's a little bit different. And our goal on the Oddcast is to tell you something you might not have already known. And this is the story of America's longest held inmate in solitary confinement. And I'll bet you most people have no idea that this was happening at the same time that Taylor Swift was winning Grammys. That this isn't ancient history. This is current contemporary history. There's so many things in our celebrity-addled culture that fly under our attention radar.
That really was. We are never, ever getting back together. So
Ever. So, there you go. Locked up. Bright lights, no human contact, more than 3 decades, a whole lifetime, basically buried alive in a small room in a supermax prison. And we'll close as we began with Tommy Silverstein's words.
You just can't do that to people year after year after year, day after day after day, and have them under that kind of pressure and not expect something to explode.
That's it for today's Oddcast, and you know us, the next episode will probably be about the invention of Miracle Whip, so make sure you check it out and give us a rating and a review and tell a friend, and let us know what you think either by dropping us an email at bobandsHeri.com, or if you have the Bob and Sheri app, it's free in Google Play and the App Store. There's a little microphone in the bottom right corner of the screen. You can tap it and talk, and the app will send your words to us as though by magic. We really appreciate your listening to this Oddcast and everything that we do, because you're the reason that we do it. Have a great day. New episodes of the Oddcast every Monday and Friday. We'll see you next time.